I want to thank you all for joining us for this final session. Oh, I'm kind of sad about all that and exploring this book, To Speak the Truth in Love. And tonight we're going to explore the significance of Theresa Kane's leadership. And as the little blurb said, in 2009, the Vatican announced wide-ranging investigations of U.S. sisters, described at the time as probably the largest investigation in church history. The largest investigation in church history. Pope Francis ended both investigations favorably for the sisters after nearly 50 years of opposition. The Vatican publicly affirmed after 50 years, the Vatican publicly affirmed contemporary expressions of religious life, first inaugurated by Theresa and her contemporaries. And we ask tonight, what lessons does this 50-year saga hold for the people of God today? So that's what we're going to explore. So before I briefly go over the rules and lead our prayer, I first of all, again, want to congratulate Chris and Theresa on their first place award in the biography category for the 2020 Excellence in Publishing Awards from the Association of Catholic Publishers. It's a well-deserved honor, and I'm sure all of you have been into the book. It just grabs you. It's written so well. And I was telling Chris tonight, I just feel like I'm right there as I'm reading it. So it's just a beautiful book. And I can't thank you enough for writing it, and for Theresa, for you for living it. So as you all know, tonight we're going to be recording this conference, including the Q&A. So if you don't want to be seen or heard, just take that in mind and turn off your camera, turn off your microphone, and you won't be on the video. We're going to turn off the chat during the presentation, and we'll turn it on at the end again, just so that everyone can stay tuned to the presentation. And then we're going to have our Q&A, and I'm going to give you the directions on how to, what to do at that time. So before we begin, I just would like to start with a prayer. And again, in light of what's going on, I am using a prayer that was written by Reverend Dr. Yolanda Pierce. She's a professor and the first female dean of the Howard University School of Divinity. Let us not rush to the language of healing before understanding the fullness of the injury and the depth of the wound. Let us not rush to offer a Band-Aid when the gaping wound requires surgery and complete reconstruction. Let us not offer false equivalencies, thereby diminishing the particular pain being felt in a particular circumstance, in a particular historical moment. Let us not speak of reconciliation without speaking of reparations and restoration, or how we can repair the breach and how we can restore the loss. Let us not rush past the loss of this mother's child, this father's child, someone's beloved son, someone's beloved daughter. Let us not value property over people. Let us not protect material objects while human lives hang in the balance. Let us not value a false peace over a righteous justice. Let us not be afraid to sit with the ugliness, the messiness, and the pain that is life in community together. Let us not offer cliches to the grieving, those whose hearts are being torn asunder. Instead, let us mourn Black and brown men and women, those killed every 28 hours. Let us lament the loss of men dead at the hands of a police officers who described them as demons. Let us weep at a criminal justice system which is neither blind nor just. Let us call for the mourning men and the wailing women, those willing to rend their garments of privilege and ease and sit in the ashes of this nation's original sin. Let us be silent when we don't know what to say. Let us be humble and listen to the pain, rage, and grief pouring from the lips of our neighbors and friends. Let us decrease so that our brothers and sisters who live on the underside of history may increase. Let us pray with our eyes open and our feet firmly planted on the ground. Let us listen to the shattering glass and let us smell the purifying fires, for it is the language of the unheard. God, in your mercy, show me my own complicity in injustice. Convict me in my indifference. Forgive me when I have remained silent. Equip me with a zeal for righteousness. Never let me grow accustomed or acclimated to unrighteousness. Amen.
Amen.
So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Chris and let her begin the evening.
Thanks, Deb. And thanks everyone for being here for another romp through the wonders of Theresa Kane's life and the wonders of this particular historical period in church history and in the history of women in the church. Certainly one aspect of the women's movement in the church is totally tied up with the history of women religious in the churches, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book. Where we left off was after many threats from the Vatican to remove Theresa from office. And this was happening toward the end of her term. So I want to really finish up some brief things about Theresa's story before connecting it to the 2009 apostolic visitation and doctrinal assessment of U.S. sisters, because the trajectory is of a piece, you know. So we'll listen to the story here. In March of 1984, the Sisters of Mercy held their 12th general chapter, and a new team was elected, and they had a beautiful, prayerful send-off for Theresa and her team. In August of that same year, Theresa received a call from the new Administrator General, the Sisters of Mercy, Sister Helen Amos, to tell her that she had received a letter from the Vatican instructing her and the Sisters of Mercy to either publicly censure Theresa or take some kind of action to differentiate Mercy leadership from their predecessors. And Helen Amos recalls being, quote, totally appalled at the idea of public censure. She says, what the letter asked of us was so far from what we considered right and just, it was ridiculous. Theresa, they let Theresa know about this. She asked if she could see it. Helen Amos showed it to her. And Theresa says that, well, they are the ones that in their consciences have to make the decision. And in her judgment, she's told Helen, you and your team need to pray and reflect about the decision you think is appropriate. So trying to sort this out was a challenge. One advocate at this time for sisters was Archbishop John Quinn from San Francisco. And there's a whole thing about the Quinn Commission and another investigation of sisters at this time, but he was an advocate for us. And anyway, Helen Amos sought his counsel, and he sort of clued her in to a Vatican Latin adage about Vatican politics, which in essence was, you are right, but we are not wrong. And so from this, Helen got the message, well, he's sympathetic, but he's also signaling there are certain battles we're not going to win, and this was one of them. So again, the new leadership had to try to figure out what they were going to do, again, with this new challenge from Rome. And they finally did sort out a way to respond. And they were helped by the new directive set at the 12th General Chapter, which had taken another look at our relationship with the church statement, which you may recall was so influential in the Mercy's advocacy on behalf of the moral agency of women and healthcare providers around tubal ligation. Anyway, that was last week's lecture. But within this statement, they had decided that they wanted to focus specifically on the church's search for truth and our part in it as a new direction, and not as much on specific women's issues, which they had really gone into in considerable depth and suffered greatly for. So they were able to respond to Rome saying that the team would not be continuing with the same controversial issues. As Helen explained, we as a community were feeling really embattled. There was a sense that we couldn't conduct our business because of so much public attention. And what we felt was that at its root, the search for truth was what we wanted to be about. We had accepted our responsibility for the communal search for truth, she said, and could not back off from it. But we had to try and pursue it under calmer circumstances, she said. So in October, she shared the letter with Theresa about the directions. Theresa understandably was very distressed by it and requested a follow-up meeting with the team. And where she shared from her perspective, she had, and actually from how it was, she had done what she was obligated to do to implement the directives of the chapter. And there was some angst. She had 4 points and all the folks were there. And it was, I think, a very painful meeting for everyone involved. But Helen Amos gently said to her, "I'm sorry, Theresa, we prayed about this and this was the best we can do." 2 days later, Theresa wrote about this in her journal, and it provides a sort of a window into her heart at the time. She says, "I met with the administrative team on Tuesday and shared my concerns. They listened and responded so reverently and graciously. I expected some hostility and defensiveness, but there was none. More and more," she said, "I feel like a revered elder. It is a rather new experience, and I need to care for the role delicately. Meeting with the team was a graced moment." And so you can see, all the pain, but all the dialogue that went into this basically impossible situation that they were in. So that was in October. On December, the Vatican accepted they got word that the Vatican had accepted Helen Amos's letter. And Theresa recalls saying that in her journal, she recognized how very much she needs to trust in God, and especially who was especially close in times of difficulties. So that was sort of the conclusion of some of the business things about Theresa and her team and the entire Sisters of Mercy faithfulness to the directions that emerged from the 1977 chapter. So it sort of brought to a close one moment of time in that, and one moment of time in Theresa's life, sort of on the business end of it, if you want to say. There was still another end of it that was Theresa's own internal sort of, I guess I would say, taking in all of the stress, anxiety, et cetera, that resulted from the visitation. And being a nurse myself, a midwife, I was especially touched by her recording in her journal of what I call an unexpected healing. And I want to relate this to you. In mid-October, Theresa attended a new mass at a parish in Silver Spring, and the sacrament of the sick had been planned as part of the liturgy. And even though she had not given her name as being a participant, Theresa decided she wanted to enter into the sacrament to receive and experience healing for myself and for our world. And she remembers, quote, "reflecting on my own brokenness and the areas of alienation, hostility, and fear in my life. And especially she found herself remembering the harrowing struggles with the institutional church. And then her journal recounts what happened. She just became, quote, overwhelmed with a tremendous sense of God's presence and a profound sense of healing within myself. She says it was as if the difficulties and the suffering of the past years, especially the suffering of the most recent years with the ecclesiastical authorities, had just been washed away. I felt, she says, an overwhelming sense of relief, peace, love, and as if something heavy had been removed from me. She says, I was very overwhelmed by the experience and I began to cry quietly, but very deeply. And at that moment, a young child, a girl who was sitting next to her, accompanied by a parent, reached over and grasped Theresa's hand. Theresa says she wanted to give me consolation. It was a beautiful moment, and I thought immediately of the phrases in scripture referring to a child leading us, the child having insights, the love and simplicity of a child. And so she prayed very earnestly to be as that young child, loving, gentle, joyous, and simple, and to wash away any ugliness, bitterness, hostility, and fear from within my very being and spirit. And that is what she prayed, so that her heart and life would be so trusting in God. At the same time, and I think this speaks deeply about how deep this healing went, I reached out in spirit to join hands with John Paul II, and I'm going to say the Apostolic Nuncio Pio Laghi, the bishops in general, and to all humankind in all parts of the earth. And so she felt she had been healed in spirit from this experience. And I don't know how many of you have suffered at the hands of church authorities. It's probably more than a few of us. And I think I can speak for myself, it can be very difficult to get past the wounds of that. But for me, this was a strong witness to the faithfulness of God to our well-being, even in the midst of the struggle. So that sort of was the healing part of this moment in Theresa's journey and adventure of life. I'm just going to go briefly over some of the subsequent things because she didn't stop there. I mean, she just was sort of getting going, really. The first thing she did is she took a sabbatical. She went to Guyana to work with people in the developing world in the ministry that some of her sisters had there that she had visited as Administrator General. And here she renewed her vows as a Sister of Mercy, saying, I recommit and rededicate the rest of my life to the core and center, God. And there was more to it, but that she says, it is to God, not institutions or structures, that I rededicate my future. From there, she spent some time with the Carmelites because she had sort of always been attracted to that, but came away knowing that that wasn't her. She, in the 90s, she spent time, or from in the 80s to 90s, she was a campus minister at their local high school in Dobbs Ferry, Our Lady of Victory. In 1990 to 97, she was on the formation team and administrator of the Dobbs Ferry Mother House. And while all of these things were going on, she was serving on multiple boards because of her great, I would say, administrative skills, but also business skills. And understanding of the big picture church. She was a proud member of the Women's Ordination Conference from its inception and served on its board for a while. She was a founding member of the Association of the Rights of Catholics in the Church. She served on the National Catholic Reporter Board for 10 years. And two agencies close to her heart that ministered to women and children in the Bronx were also the recipients of her gifts. Theresa always had a huge heart for the poor. And of course, women and children are among the poorest. So they're of a piece. Theresa is also especially beloved for her support of LGBTQ plus rights. New Ways Ministry co-founder Loretta's sister Janine Gramick describes her as, quote, a visionary on the issue. And in the late 1970s, the Mercy and this is early 1970s, the Mercy administrative team endorsed a New Ways newspaper and supported the civil rights of LGBTQ ad. It was an ad supporting the civil rights of LGBTQ people. And I just have this quote from Janine that pretty much describes what happened when she met with Theresa and the team to discuss the issue. And Janine says, Theresa went a step farther, asking about ways to support gay and lesbian priests and nuns. We weren't even talking about gay priests or lesbian nuns in 1978, she says. A couple years later, in 1981, we had our first major symposium for Catholic leaders, including diocesan leaders, LCWR, and the men's communities. And Theresa was one of the major speakers about what we should be doing as leaders on this issue. And mind you, of course, New Ways Ministry is still doing these fantastic workshops all over the place. But Theresa was the one who said, we have to do this too. So 1995, Theresa received a Master of Arts in Women's History from Sarah Lawrence College. And in the late summer of that very same year, she attended the 4th UN Conference on Women in Beijing as a delegate for the Sisters of Mercy. From 1995 until this very day and into the future, Theresa has taught thousands of students at Mercy College at 3 of its 4 campuses in the greater New York City area. And in 2000, she became an associate professor in a new Master's in Public Health Administration program and began teaching graduate students. And one of the things about Mercy College, which is no longer like it's a Catholic value institution, but it's not under hierarchical control. And so that gave Theresa great freedom in her wide national speaking ministry. Mercy College loved that she was doing the great speaking. She never got any pushback because of some of the things she was saying. I should also say that Mercy College particularly reaches kids who have high financial need or view themselves as first-generation college students. Diversity is highly valued there, with students hailing from 35 countries and 38 states. So this is, and I know I went with her one day and had the privilege of sitting in on one of her classes, and it was like a mini UN. There were kids from all over the place. It was wonderful. In any case, she is probably best known to many of us here as for her national speaking ministry, which she has carried on for 40 years now. More frequently than not, she was invited to speak on women's issues, particularly women in church and society, a 21st century vision, and she had literally hundreds of venues on that topic. Often there would be when she spoke at Catholic venues, there were conservative Catholics chanting and carrying signs demonstrating against her appearance. At one point when she was speaking at Bishop Thomas Gumbleton's parish in Detroit, the Archdiocese banned her from speaking there. But the group that brought her, a wonderful group called Elephants in the Living Room, it's because they're willing to talk about the elephants in the living room, but they're both lay and clergy, quickly relocated the presentation. And an event that was originally expected to attract about 400 people drew over 800 justice-minded Detroit Catholics. So this was, sort of happened a fair amount, I think, Anyway, so this is just a little flavor of what's been, after the sort of high profile, high tension stuff. This woman has led an extraordinarily fruitful life and has just been a wonderful inspiration to so many of us who came after her. But of course, as we know, the tensions over these years between sisters and the Vatican continued. And I just want to do a little overview because I do think Theresa's story and that of the Sisters of Mercy is an important chapter in the history of U.S. women's religious and of the people of God. And because, as we know, the Second Vatican Council invited all of us to embrace a new spiritual maturity. Prior to Vatican II, as many know, most Catholics have been content to have priests and bishops tell us what to do. Our job was to obey whatever rules the hierarchy set forth, and then our salvation would be assured. While women religious did exercise significant initiative in inaugurating new ministries in education and health, they too were subject to a hierarchy that expected the same blind obedience from them that they expected from the rest of the laity. But again, Vatican II recognized the power of the Holy Spirit at work in the lives of the faithful, who, Lumen Gentium, it said, were marvelously called and wonderfully prepared so that ever more abundant fruits of the Spirit may be produced in them. It further enjoined ordinary Catholics to freely make their needs and desires known to church leaders, even saying they had at times the obligation to express their opinion on those things which concern the good of the church. And that's Lumen Gentium 37. Yet, as we have seen, sadly, in Theresa's story and that of the Sisters of Mercy and that of many other sisters and lay leaders, many, if not most, in the church's hierarchy were not ready to hear their experience or our experience of the leading of God in our lives, God's leading in our service. And so, as we know, the council did create a compelling theological vision of the church as a people of God, but it did not create structures that would help us make that vision a reality. The bishops at the council thought that would happen with the annual meetings of the Synod of Bishops, but that didn't happen. That whole agenda was, over a period of years, co-opted by bureaucrats at the Curia in Rome, and basically the bishops were disempowered. Also going on at the same time, reactions from Catholic conservatives who were angry and upset over changes in a church they thought would never change, contributed to many controversies and conflicts that we as the church experienced in ensuing years, in the past 50 years actually, and of course still going on. Now, the downside of this, there were very few safe spaces where the faithful, even with differing opinions, could talk with one another about things that concern the good of the church. And various groups and organizations, like Elephants in the Living Room and Future Church and others who wanted to have these conversations, were quickly told they were not allowed to meet on church property. And so even though we had a deepening worldwide priest shortage, there was significant polarization over issues such as ordaining married as well as celibate priests and opening the diaconate and priesthood to women. And in the United States, the Catholic social teaching about justice and peace was eclipsed by issues relating to human sexuality, such as the human rights of LGBTQ Catholics and moral decision-making in human reproduction. And so one's beliefs about the latter two quickly became a litmus test for the Catholic brand and led to, who was a true Catholic and who wasn't. And then there's hierarchical politics, because Pope John Paul II centralized power in the Vatican to a degree unprecedented in modern times, and this was over 25 years. I know I'm reviewing this for some of you, but some of you are not necessarily conversant with this, so I want to go over it because it's important to what's going to come after. Anyway, because of the centralization, many, if not most, non-doctrinal decisions by national bishops' conferences had to be approved by Rome. And probably the poster child for this is what happened with the 20-year in the making new 1998 English Mass and Lectionary that had been approved already by all of the English-speaking bishops' conferences in the world. And this new translation lectionary got completely overturned by a small group of men in the Vatican bureaucracy. And in my mind, which is one of the reasons why we have pretty bad mass translations right now. So that's just a picture, but I just want you to see such was the hierarchical church in which Theresa and the Sisters of Mercy and other religious orders over the last 50 years sought to speak our truth in love. So you can see it's tough going there. So here we go. 30 years after Theresa's greeting to the Pope John Paul II, his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, or Joseph Ratzinger, authorized dual investigations of U.S. sisters. In January 2009, the Congregation for Religious initiated an apostolic visitation of 341 orders of U.S. sisters, which has been called the largest investigation in U.S. and the church history. And in February of 2009, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith launched what they called a doctrinal assessment of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, which represents 80% of all U.S. women's communities. So, and just a little recall here, Ratzinger was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith when in late 1984, it tried to censure Theresa. So when Helen Amos got this thing, we want you to censor Theresa, at that time, Archbishop Ratzinger was prefect of the CDF. So just saying, okay? Anyway, the unprecedented, actually, you know what? I want to correct that because the request actually came from the congregation that govern religious orders. But just so you know, these were the players that were the powerful players in Rome. So anyway, so here we are with these two investigations going on, and it resulted in widespread support all over the United States from Catholic lay people and others who rallied in over hundreds of prayer services over a period of 6 years in cathedrals and churches all over. There were over 100,000 letters written in support of the sisters. Nobody could understand what prompted these investigations. Were U.S. bishops diverting attention from their own problems, covering up clergy sex abuse? Was the LCWR investigation payback because LCWR supported the Affordable Care Act, whereas the U.S. bishops didn't, and they were unhappy about it? Actually, the bishops withdrew their backing after initially approving it, ostensibly over the scientifically untenable belief that IUDs and birth control pills are abortifacient. That's why the bishops withdrew their support, even though there's no science behind what they were saying. For the apostolic visitation, there were requests for extensive investigations and reports of each order's financial status, which no orders did under the advice of canon lawyers, that was not required. And so no one cooperated with that. But you have to wonder, why were they asking? Were bishops looking for ways to shore up their own coffers to pay legal fees from clergy sex abuse? The fact is, no one knew the answer to these questions, and I don't think anybody still knows the answers to these questions, but they were all raised at the time. So in 2012, as his last act going out from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Levada issued a censure of LCWR, mandating that all of their programs had to be vetted first. So, and of course, then there was a 3-bishop group that was supposed to implement the mandate, Archbishop Sarton being one, Paprocki, and I believe Leonard Blair is the other one. At the same time, the president of LCWR at the time, Pat Farrell, at that 2012 in that same year, made it clear that the sisters were going to stand in their truth and exercise their own inner moral agency in this decision-making in an appropriate way. She, in her speech, she encouraged the sisters to speak with their truth with courage. And she made the statement, you can cut back some of the flowers, but you can't hold back the spring. And she's quoting from a phrase she learned when she ministered in Chile under a military dictatorship. So I'm just sort of giving you a little capsule about how this was. So that was in 2012. I want to turn now just briefly to a wonderful book about this time, because it does shine light on what's going on. And the book is called However Long the Night, and it's published by the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And it gives a window into what were the experiences of the sister leaders who were trying to engage in these negotiations. And I will quote first from Sister Janet Mock, who at one point wrote, and because each of them reflected on their own experience. And Janet was the executive director of LCWR, so she was there for the whole duration of the 6 years. And she asked, how does one go about developing an authentic relationship with a group of people who, in our experience, took words out of our context and acted against us on that misrepresentation of truth, she asked. When there is no truth, there is no trust, and consequently no authentic relationship. She said, by way of explanation, the men with whom we were speaking interpreted the way we prayed together and spoke about God and the things of God as a violation of Catholic orthodoxy. We, in turn, had spent more than 50 years as an organization encouraging member congregations to study and pray with the documents of Vatican II, which resulted in well-developed spiritualities consistent with each congregation's charism. Sister Carol Zen, who was in the presidency at the time, a sister of St. Joseph from Philadelphia, commented that a key issue guiding how LCWR understood its responsible use of influence during this very fraught time concerned the Vatican II renewal that, she said, led to, quote, and underline this twice, an adult educated laity, and I quote, there was a deeper conversation that yearned to emerge, said Carol, a broader understanding of the core issues and a profound movement of the spirit, prompting all of us to discernment and fidelity in new and challenging ways. The CDF mandate, said Carol, was about an adult, educated laity, in this case, a group of women religious whose vision of a Vatican II church had guided their renewal, framed their discernment for more than 50 years, and claimed their fidelity. And so it was reflections like this that is one reason why so many lay people rallied to the sisters, because in many ways they were fighting the battle for lay inclusion in church decision-making structures. I mean, we're not there, but this was what was happening, some of the transformation that was trying to be born, in my view. So, as we know, on December 14th, 2014, the Vatican, under Pope Francis, a year and a half after he was elected, withdrew. The apostolic visitation came to a very positive conclusion. And the following, in 2015, the CDF mandate was resolved. So I want to just talk about 3 historic precedents that I believe emerged from the sisters' experience of being investigated by 2 Vatican offices. The first one is that contemporary expressions of religious life were finally affirmed publicly, not only by the tens of thousands of ordinary Catholics who strongly supported the sisters, but by the Vatican itself. And during the December 14th gathering, I'll just quote a brief thing of it. The statement said, women religious sought to adapt their lifestyle and mission in ways that might enable them to more effectively respond to contemporary needs. In a spirit of creative fidelity to the charisms, they branched out in new ministries to those most on the margins in church and society. And they notably pursued ongoing theological and professional formation. Now, the reason this is big is because, remember, going back to the Vatican Council, they wouldn't even let Sister Mary Luke Tobin or any of the other women religious into the committee that was going to shape and decide the future of religious life. Cardinal Antonucci absolutely boycotted them. Then the struggles from Theresa's time, but also with Betty Carroll, with allowing the sisters to choose to wear a habit or not. So this is basically all women religious got who were trying to do Vatican II renewal was criticism, and threats. I mean, I hate to be this way. I'm talking from Rome. We got a huge amount of support different times from different priests, different bishops, but this is the first time there had ever been a positive validation of the contemporary ways of living religious life. So I think that's historic. The second one is a surprising joint statement from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and LCWR leaders. And I don't know how much you know about the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but usually it's investigating some theologian that they're not happy with. And Sister Sharon Holland, who had worked in the Vatican for many years in the Office for Religious, wrote in this However Long the Night book, quote, those who are in this very understated statement, I'd say, those who are familiar with the procedures of the Roman Curia will recognize that the results of a CDF study of the doctrinal stances of an individual or group normally end with a statement from the dicastery. This process ended with a joint statement. Now, this is pretty amazing when you consider that just a couple of years earlier, first of all, the CDF doesn't do joint statements. And second of all, especially not with an organization that had roundly criticized just a few years earlier. So that was a pretty big thing. And I think the third historic precedent is finally on April 16th, 2015, there was a private meeting between Pope Francis and the LCWR leadership, which marks the first time any Pope ever met privately with LCWR leadership. And when you think about it, remember when Theresa first came to when Pope John Paul II first came to the United States in 1979, and LCWR leaders tried vainly to get meetings with him and were denied, even though they represented 180,000 US women religious at the time. So it just doesn't seem like it should have taken that long, but it did happen. So that's a good thing. So clearly much had changed between US women religious and Vatican officials since the time that Theresa and the Sisters of Mercy initiated dialogue about women's moral agency and equality in the church. And just a little recall, when the Mercy leaders first attempted to discuss their community's prophetic Our Relationship with the Church statement, the Congregation for Religious had not even read it beforehand. They had sent it twice and even delayed a meeting by 3 days so that they could read it, and they still hadn't read it. So and of course that document forthrightly named the Mercy's community's sense of responsibility for assisting in the church's search for truth and to participate in the evolution of church teaching. So again, that's 1977, 1978. But as we saw, what happened is that the Vatican opposed the sisters' exercise of moral agency and decision-making authority. And they were exercised on behalf of the women that they were serving in their hospitals, and actually punished the sisters for seeking to dialogue about it. So here we are today. At least that's, at least for me, the most important outcome, perhaps, of the Vatican investigations was that the US sister leaders were finally at the table with their issues. Their concerns and their moral agency were taken seriously, not albeit at considerable personal cost, like 6 years of threats, and notwithstanding substantial suspicion on the part of Vatican officials. So, final part, what are the lessons and learnings? Well, here's what I see, and you probably have some of your own, but I think for me, the first one is how important it is to use our own God-given voices when situations of injustice arise, and especially injustice that it's close to home, in this case, in the church for women religious. And of course, we can look all around us, and this applies in a lot of areas. So Theresa boldly used her voice to directly address John Paul II about inequality and unjust treatment of women in the church. The Sisters of Mercy directly addressed and used their voice to raise important issues about women's health and Catholic women's voices in political leadership and the lack of women's voices in church decision-making. So it's important to use our voice. The second one, important learning for me, was the importance to both have faith and be faithful to the truth of one's experience of God's leading in the church, or one's experience of God's leading in oneself. I think that the positive conclusion of the Vatican's 2 investigations of U.S. sisters suggests that the fidelity to the truth of one's experience of God is costly, but it's ultimately transformative for both the individual and for the church. Now, so I want to be careful about that, because I think it's important to note that listening to one's experience of God happens in a communal context. So as the LCWR was going through this and various religious congregations were going through this, it wasn't, oh, this is what I think and this is how it's going to go. Oh no, there was a whole lot of discussion, dialogue, sharing the state of our hearts as we Sisters of St. Joseph do. And out of that comes the discernment. But you have to be able to stand in the truth of your experience. And that is exactly what LCWR and the sisters did. They were not going to go away from the table, and they were not going to be deterred from owning the truth that had been revealed to them in their own faith belief of God's action in them. And in and as we see, that ended up being transformative, I think, for the church, that I think learned something, the broader church. And I guess maybe this goes without saying, but I'm going to say it. It's important to speak these truths in a way that neither alienates nor refuses to hear the sacred truths of another. So you don't want to get in the way of that truth just by the way you say it. You know, you want to always make room for the other person to receive what you're trying to say. So you don't want to start out by insulting them and saying, this is the truth. You know, you guys get that. So anyway, it's just, I think, this sort of exchange that Theresa came espoused, and I would say even relished in her exercise of leadership. And of course, many Sisters of Mercy and LCWR leaders were influenced by her example of forthrightly putting her own truth on the table, but also making room for others to place their truths on the table also. So I think that while Theresa's vision of full ministerial equality of women in the Catholic Church is far from being realized, I do believe we may be a little bit closer to that long-sought ideal because of the dialogic breakthrough that was the unforeseen blessing of the Vatican's rebuke of Catholic sisters. The sister leaders' contemplative approach and inclusive decision-making processes made room, I believe, for the Spirit of God to lead and guide them and the prelates that Rome had appointed to investigate them. So, to end here, full equality in the Catholic Church will not happen until the structures of Catholicism are themselves transformed to allow women and men, gay and straight, lay and ordained, to bring their own contemplative experience of God in Jesus Christ to the discernment and decision-making table. Because in the end, we're really supposed to be all about what God wants on earth as well as in heaven, right? And so I think Theresa's passionate life and witness arise from her own deep experience of the mystery of God. It's here that she found strength, despite substantial persecution, to pursue a vision of equality and justice for women in the church and in society. It is here that she learned to speak the truth in love. Amen.
Oh, beautiful.
I'm done.
Beautiful.
Questions?
Okay. So, Theresa, how would you like to respond, comment?
I was just reflecting on the fact that for many of us, it's really been and truly a journey that it certainly has been spirited dynamic. It has been at times painful, but I think that what has happened among many women religious, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, that we had solidarity because we had also strong community experiences. And even as we think of LCWR, how that became such a dynamic part of our lives, as did the IUSG in Rome. The world were women who came at great expense, and some of them had such very terrible stories about their relationships with bishops in Africa. A number of those were young, but they also had to be very subjected to that particular bishop in order even to get an education. So I just was trying to put it together and say that it certainly has been a mystery. That's probably what helps me a great deal, is that it's a mystery, and it's a mystery to be lived, really. And we join together as women religious, and then again our ability to be able to extend even our community life. We have opened our doors to many people of different religions, different races. And as a fruit of that, we have been invited in to many of these new experiences. So I just found the last part tonight, Chris, to be very energizing, and to just, in a sense, we almost each day we live our lives again, and we start over, and that's a grace. That's a God-given grace that we have, and I just thank Chris for opening that up for us. Is that better, Debbie?
It's better, but it's probably maybe your internet connection, but it is definitely better when you're back a little bit. So that's good. So we'll do the best we can here. So is it okay if we open up for questions now? Is that all right with you? Is that all right with you if we open up for questions now?
Yes.
Theresa, are you ready?
A question, Debbie, that came in since last Tuesday, and I think you may have a copy of it, or as to.
I have it. If you need
thank you, Chris.
Yeah. One of the early questions was, have we gotten any pushback from any powers that be for the book, or clerics, or any feedback? And the answer is no, we have not. The short question.
Not yet. Not yet, Chris.
Not yet. Yeah, right. Okay, well, we'll see. The other question that came in, which I thought was good, to ask about the support that Theresa did or did not experience from other congregations of sisters as she went through the various crises that we talked about. And did the collaboration among communities increase or become more evident over time? So Theresa, I'll let you take this and then I'll chime in.
Yes, and I think that one memory that I had, and then Chris added to it, was that when the Sisters of Mercy were experiencing the tremendous traumatic changes that were going on in terms of the life of Sister Agnes Mary Mansour, and Sister Helen Marie mentioned it at the end of last week, that among her experience, what was very sad is that bishops did not approach her and even want to know what was the quality or how was Agnes Mary in terms of being a woman religious, being a Sister of Mercy. And of course, we knew from having worked and lived with Agnes that she certainly was a spirited woman and a very spiritual woman. But what I do remember very clearly after the decision was made, and I have always said that the decision that was made that day was made by the clerical state of the Catholic Church, not by the women religious, not by the religious community. And she was treated as a cleric. I was told she either had to comply or she had 24 hours to leave the community. It was a deeply, deeply sad experience. And this may have been in the biography, but I do remember before I went to Rome, we had a meeting over there of IUSG. I deliberately called Archbishop Piolagi and I said, I am going to this meeting in Rome. I was concerned about going to it, but I said, you need to tell me that no decision or action will be taken in regard to Sister Agnes Mary while I am out of the country. He assured me immediately there would be no action taken. Unfortunately, about 4 days later, when I was in the middle of the meeting, is when the action was taken. So I always consider that to be a betrayal on the part of the hierarchy. But at the same time, what was very strong for us, the LCWR Executive Committee, as soon as this story was related to them, they issued a very strong press release. Now, they're not into usually doing many press releases, especially about a difficult situation like that. But they issued a press release and sent it out extensively around the country and internationally, supporting Agnes Mary Mansour, supporting the Sisters of Mercy, and raising many questions about it. So that was just a gift to us. But the other experience I had was Sister Mary Luke Tobin and I were attending a meeting of LCWR, and she was just a delightful woman, lived to be almost the mid-90s. And the only concern she had immediately before she died was to make sure that President Obama was elected. And then she was happy about that. But she turned to me and said, I want to invite all the presidents to come to Colorado, former and present presidents, so that we would have a celebration and that we want to thank you for what you did. And at that gathering, we had probably almost everyone from the first president right up to the president at that time in 1984. We had a beautiful day, a very reflective day, a joyous day, happy day. And I think very, very few, unless they could not get in from Rome, were there. And people like Sister Betty Carroll was there, and many of the women who had come before us, and then the wonderful women that came after us were also there. So those were wonderful experiences of support. And my only final one is that when I returned from Rome, I did ask to see Archbishop Laghi because I was very concerned about what had happened and the fact that he really did betray my trust. And I went to see him. I had a conversation with him. I said that exactly to him. And he said, it's hard for you to understand how Rome works. He said, they tell someone who tells someone else who tells me, and I tell you. And I said, well, that's most unfortunate, but that is not how I have lived my life. And that is not how many of the women religious will in any way be living lives in the future. I brought a closure to it for myself, as sad as it was.
Wow.
That better, Debbie?
It's much better. It's much better.
I just want to add that at the time of the thing of Agnes Mary Mansour, there was a huge groundswell from sister organizations protesting how the Vatican treated her. Network, the executive committee of LCWR, as Theresa said, the National Coalition of American Nuns, the National Association of Women Religious all issued press statements. And plus, on Pentecost Sunday, May 22nd, 1982, prayer vigils on her behalf were held in many cities around the U.S. So there was a lot of solidarity, and I just by way of, about the gathering of all the former presidents of LCWR honoring Theresa, somebody created a song that said, "We are all sisters of mercy," and they all sang it together. So
I think it may have been Mary Hunt. I'm not sure, but I know Mary Hunt is on tonight. Yeah. But you'll remember it.
That's fabulous. So, do you have any more questions that you wanted to go over, or are you okay? So what we'll do is we'll go into the Q&A part of this meeting, and what we'll do is if you would like, Russ is going to open things up, and if you want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute your microphone, and as they come up on the list, I will try to take them in order, and I will call on you. So once you unmute, don't ask your question yet, but let me give you a call on you, and we will ask, and I'll let you ask your questions. So it looks like Rita Houlihan, you have a question?
Oh, I thank you so much. First, Theresa, thank you for your stamina and your faithfulness. And Chris, thank you so much for this wonderful history. I don't think I'll get the exact date right, but when the Sisters of Mercy were forced to, I guess, rescind their statement of their support for discerning how to support women in all their needs, spiritual and medical, and they had to change that. Do you think that was really because mostly about the need for women who may need a tubal ligation, and the Vatican just didn't want any Catholics even discussing that? And so that's my first question. And then the second is, as a result of having to rescind and restate a purpose that didn't focus so much on women's issues, did that, does anybody advocate for Catholic women actually, or women in Catholic hospitals now? So those are my questions.
Thank you. Kathy, is that your name? Yes.
Rita.
Kathy,
Rita.
I'm sorry, excuse me. I think that in terms of what the Sisters of Mercy was really issued a document, our relationship within the church. And within that, one of the issues that was highlighted was that of tubal ligation within Catholic hospitals. So we actually began that study by doing a survey of what were the Mercy hospitals at that time. And what was our finding was not surprising to a number of our sisters who were in the health field, but that we found a differing experience in different hospitals and in different dioceses. We had usually boards within the hospital and committees within the board. And the committees, some of them were dealing with the question of right to life issues.
Theresa?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think the question was, after Helen Amos had to write to Rome to say we're not going to be pursuing women's issues in the same way, what happened? Did the Sisters of Mercy continue? What happened in the Catholic hospitals? Were anybody advocating for those same things after your term?
Oh, I was just probably zeroing in on the end of my term, but I think the Mercy sisters who are here could probably speak to the rest of it. But we did find a big difference of experience, and we did present that to the bishops that we had met in committee. And of course, when the investigation was finished, we were actually told that, of course, there was not to be discussion of it, which was not possible. It was going on within the hospital committees that were formed, but that we ended up providing a statement that said what was going on in the health facilities with the approval of your own board and your own bishop, you would continue that policy. So we really did not change the policy they were already following. Now, in terms of then, when I had finished, Sister Helen Amos and her team, and Sister Helen Marie Burns was on that team, I think their own sense of what was just and what was of integrity, they really followed. And as you said, it was in December where they did receive a response to what was the initial request, which was to do perhaps some termination of myself. I'm not sure as a Sister of Mercy, but in some way to make some public statement, which of course they did not do. Chris, any other recollections on the book?
Well, and I'm also aware that I think Helen Marie Burns is on, so I don't know if she would want to respond to that. But one thing I know of that happened after, within months, is that there was a Catholic statement on pluralism and abortion that was signed by some 24 nuns. And that, and basically it just said there were diversity of opinions. There had been a research study showing that only 11% of Catholics surveyed disapprove of abortion in all circumstances. And so I think the signers of this were trying to say, look, this is a pluralistic society, and not all Catholics agree. And this led to really big blowback. And I know the Sisters of Mercy were involved in trying to negotiate, and there were all the women's religious communities who were involved. And so they had to negotiate that over the next 3 to 4 years. I don't know as much about it as other people do, but I do know that there was an attempt to say, look, we need to talk about this.
Mm-hmm. I think Helen is got her mic off. So Helen Burns, I don't know if you want to make any more comments.
Well, I would just say briefly to read it, because it's a very complicated situation, but briefly, yes, the Sisters of Mercy continue within their healthcare institutions and also within the congregation to try to address especially the women's questions around health and reproductive health. That New York Times ad was about a 3-year effort that ended not well in the sense of what we had hoped for, but certainly it did create a conversation and a public display of differences of opinion among theologians, ethicists, and persons within the church. And then, of course, most recently, so as Theresa has indicated, most of the work is done with the local bishop in ethics committees, trying to work out some arrangements where the issues can be discussed and dealt with and not necessarily get the publicity that then pushes the official church back into its what would you say, its stance. Yeah. It's so. I mean, our most recent situation, of course, is the situation out in Arizona, where one of our hospitals, make a long story short, stood with a woman in a situation which was very much a threat to her life, the life of her child, and as a result, because of some issues about right to life, ended up having its name Catholic withdrawn. However, we stood with the hospital, stood with the sisters, stood with the community. They stood with us. And while the name might not have been Catholic, according to the bishop, in the language of the people, it was a Catholic hospital. So thank you, Rita. But yes, it's a long battle that continues.
Thanks, Helen. My gosh, it's wonderful to hear this history. Susan Maloney, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I would. Hello, Theresa. This is Susan in Los Angeles. Can you
Oh,
hear
I
me?
know you well, Susan, and we were talking about Anita Casper last week, your great friend.
Well, I'm going to make a quote, a very famous woman, and I think you might be remembered this. It's from one of our conversations. The Immaculate Heart experience was a pivotal point, a lightning rod. American religious would not have been as effective in making the renewal changes without Anita Casper and the IHMs. In a very powerful manner, Anita Casper and the IHMs expanded the environment of change for U.S. women religious and led the way. This is a new form of religious life. Now, that was in our conversation in 2014. And it's 6 years. What I'd like to ask you is, why is it even the best of us who are in religious life do not see the pre-religious life, and that is the pre-canonical status, as a legitimate form of Catholic religious life? And with all the corruption in the institutional church, do you ever see women's religious communities having the power of recognition of other communities that are parallel or eliminate the canonical status? In other words, the practice would come before the policy. And I think at one point in our discussions, you talked about that, the idea of having a body of recognition by women religious communities. Can you talk to that in terms of your statement here of the future of religious life?
Thank you, Susan. And I remember it very well, and I know through many of our chapters and our plenary gatherings, that question has come up through the years. Why are we continuing to be canonical? It has just in some ways tied us down, or we have not been able to be as spiritually we would want to be to be able to be as apostolically maybe enhanced more than we are. And I think that IHM and Anita Casper and those women back in the late 1960s, if I have the date right, that they were very courageous, and they stood up against Cardinal McIntyre, who happened to be a New York bishop out in California. And he gave out the directive that they were not allowed to go into the classrooms without a habit. And that was a big struggle for them. It had more to do than the garment. It had to do with the whole relationship that we would have with the hierarchy in a particular diocese. So they made the decision to continue to be a religious community, but not with the canonical status. And that has been very influential through the years. The National Association of Women Religious came forth as a result of that. And now that's a group of women religious. Many of them are canonical, not all of them, but they form their own organization. I have been in communication with a number of religious communities, some who work directly with the bishop, some who do not, but they are in diocesan work. They formed as a community. They're non-canonical, and it's working out very well. I did not see it coming through the years as a strong direction for many of us who were in established religious communities. But I think that what we did within our communities through our chapters and through our plenary gatherings brought us to a stronger position as women religious, and directing our own lives within our communities. So I think what was done in California certainly has been seen in other places. Something such as a women's ordination conference. We've had several women religious who actually were told they were not to be on that board, and a few of them continued to be on the board. For some reason, I'm not sure why I got missed, because I had been a member and been on the board since it began, but I actually never had any communication about it. So any one of these organizations that we see now and that Chris just referred to, I think are very much the fruits of what was done way back there in California.
Thank you, Theresa. Good to see you.
Thank you, Susan. You too.
You got to come back to the villa to Santa Cruz. We're waiting for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. All right. Thank you. Sadiqa Engel.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here because you, Theresa, and the other women religious in my life and in my consciousness have been such wise and courageous witnesses to the Christian vision. It makes me so proud to be a woman. And the question I have is, during all your tribulations, was there any organized support from priests in the church? Because it seems to me, even at this time in history, I have many priest friends who say privately it's also unjust with women, but there doesn't seem to be any real support publicly for justice for women in the church. And I was wondering what your experience was and what you think of the current situation with priests and support for women.
I think the priests have tried themselves to certainly move into associations. They're probably more social. Some of them are really sharing of theology. I know a number of priests who take turns doing homilies, and they share them with each other. I think they have found a great deal of support in community and in a collegial way. But I think because they're not part of the community, as at least diocesan priests, that has not been part of their experience. And in more and more, many of them are living alone. So a sense of communal living, such as we have always had, I think is very foreign to them and probably not very attractive to them also. So I would distinguish the diocesan priests from the order priests. I think many of the order priests have very strong community experiences. And I welcome anyone else who wants to add to that. Go ahead.
I will just note that in 2011, the National Federation of Priest Councils gave an award to the Leadership Conference of Women Religious right in the middle of the doctrinal assessment. They gave the Mandatum Award because of their service to the gospel of Jesus Christ exemplifies the purposes and goals of the Federation. So that was the only one that I'm aware of in terms of the research that I did, though I imagine, like many of us, there are very supportive priests behind the scenes, but not too many that speak publicly.
That's right.
Okay. All right, let's move on. We have many questions here. Somebody named Soprano One. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi. I'm sorry, I had my new computer put in and I have to change the name. It's Mary Moore. And I wanted to say, as a lay woman, I stand in awe of the religious sisters because they had such a great influence on my life. And boy, Pia Loggy, talk about mansplaining to you. And I think that's, from a lay perspective, looking at the hierarchy, I think they fear some of the religious women because you're much more educated than they are. And I think, again, I don't want to generalize, but I think several of them are very comfortable in the lives they lead, and the sisters challenged them on that just by your example. And the fact that through the years, you have gone through so many changes personally and socially. And I mean, changing the habit was something major, but it's minor compared to the fact that when a lot of sisters entered the convent, they could either teach or be nurses, and that was it. And now the sisters have just expanded. They've changed their lives, and I think a lot of the hierarchy get very comfortable just being where they are. And the other thing is, I'm grateful for the book, Chris, and Theresa. I wrote you an email. My aunt, Sister Mary Eileen Moore, was administrator of Mercy Hospital in Des Moines. And I used to go out to visit her. And now hearing about all of the things you women went through in the 80s with this tubal litigation, and here she was administrator of a hospital during that period, it's really explained a lot of things for me about what she was going through. And as you say, they had to keep a lot of this confidential. And sometimes I'd see a furrowed brow, and I was just a kid, but now it all comes home for me. I was named after her. So thank you. And I was brought up by the Sisters of Mercy in grammar school in the Bronx, St. Margaret Mary's, which I'm sure you know. And one last thing, I don't want to take too much time, but my experience being brought up by the Sisters of Mercy was that they were always very wonderful in taking children and giving them the opportunities to get to know ourselves and enhancing our talents. The sisters pushed me on the stage to sing, and I became a professional singer after that. So thank you. It means so much to see you.
Thanks.
And know your story.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you very much for that beautiful reflection. And I must say that through our years, that it has become mutual. I think there has really been a tremendous solidarity of women religious and women within the Catholic community, and not in any way to leave out the other denominations, but certainly in working with many different women in different areas of life. And also, I think in development that many religious communities have taken on is the association. So if a woman is very interested in connecting with the community and would like maybe to be maybe more included, we have the association where a woman does not need to formally enter the order, but would be an associate member and present at many of our gatherings and at our celebrations. And that has really been a great grace to us because it has enhanced our communications, has deepened our solidarity, but it also has been a gift for us to have the insights of some of the women who may be single, may be married, may be single and then divorced, and also is certainly, as we know, as Chris spoke about earlier, about women and men, gay and lesbian community that has also, in a sense, been very much a part of our journey.
Thank you, Theresa. Okay, we have a question from, I don't know the name, but it's PFETTIG. Do you have a question?
No, well, actually, I do. There is a book by Melinda Gates, and I was very impressed with her book, The Moment of Lift, Empowering Women. And she seems to be taking on much of what you have been talking about in Africa and in third world countries about empowering women. It all revolves around birth control and family planning. And I'm wondering if the Sisters of Mercy, I know that she's Catholic educated, but I'm wondering if any of you have had any thoughts about that, have known about it, and how that can be how you can work with her, in other words, to advance this in the world.
Thank you.
Well, I know there are a number of religious communities that are working very closely with the women religious in different parts of Africa. We have several Sisters of Mercy who have been present to different countries in Africa, working with young women religious. Many of them, the women religious in those countries, are young, and they have been working with them and working with their ministries as well. And it certainly has been very fruitful. I do think it's going on, and maybe more than we even realize. And I found my own experience with the women religious in Africa because they were so young and they were very spiritual. But they also, I think the detriment I saw was so many of them were diocesan communities and therefore very dependent, usually only on one bishop. And that if they were not in good graces with that bishop, they were not going to advance in education. They were not going to be visiting different countries if there was such a pilgrimage coming up. So that became a drawback for them. But I think they learned a great deal by being at these international meetings and were very courageous and went back and made some very significant changes in their own communities. Now, that would be my reflection, and I'm sure there are others would be able to add to that.
Okay. Anything else? Do you need to say one more thing? Anybody?
Can I say one thing?
Who's this?
Patty May.
Oh, Patty. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I just want to say it's kind of a little silly, but I'm happy to be in the company of so many women who are considered heretics. I'm glad that the church doesn't burn people anymore.
Right.
So,
I just want to say that I was called a heretic by my novice director. And now that would have been, 50 plus years ago, I was called a heretic. And, you don't get called heretics by your novice director and smile about it. I mean, that's big time serious.
Oh, wow. Wow.
We survived. We survived.
My gosh. Okay, friends, I don't want it to end, but I think it should, so we can not keep everybody up all night. Oh my gosh, this has been such a blessing. So Russ, would you like to lead us in a final prayer and some youth last announcements or whatever? I'm kind of...
Sure, I would just... I would just urge everyone to visit futurechurch.org, check out our Women Erased series. We have another one coming up with Professor Carol Dempsey, who's a Dominican sister, on June 18th, Tuesday, about reading the Bible against the grain. And please just save the date, July 22nd, 7:00 p.m. That's a Wednesday. Hopefully we'll soon have an announcement to make about our Mary of Magdala celebration, but we will be celebrating Mary of Magdala via Zoom on that day. I thought for our prayer, we could return to where I started a couple weeks ago with St. Catherine of Siena and her quote, "We've had enough exhortations to be silent. Cry out with 100,000 tongues. I see that the world is rotten because of silence." Amen.
Well, let's turn on the mics, and we will end this again by a cheerful goodbyes to one another. And I just want to say again, Chris and Theresa and Florence and Helen and all you wonderful women, we love you madly. We're so glad you're in our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.